I'm KevDog, and it's time to finish what we started. Couldn't keep you waiting too much longer, could we? Yesterday, we finally released our thoughts on the first game in the recently released Great Ace Attorney duology, and today we'll be discussing our thoughts on the second game in the duology, the Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you should go do that now. Obviously, these two games' stories are directly interconnected, and our thoughts on those earlier cases have influenced our thoughts on these later cases. You can't have one game without the other.
I am 256Pyre the Wonky Angle returning again, and if you're too stubborn to go back and watch part 1 of this video, I'll briefly restate some of our intro and the disclaimers that come with it. We'll be discussing each case in chronological order, and at the end of each segment, we'll tell you where in our old ranking of all the other 40 Ace Attorney cases, each case in this game would go. Keep in mind that it's all just our opinions and you can feel free to disagree with us. And of course be warned of all the spoilers. We recommend you play through the whole game before hearing what we have to say, which is admittedly less important to say here than it might have been for part 1 of this video, but still be warned that hints of what's to come later may need to be dropped within our reviews of earlier cases as something of a necessity for how interconnected the story of these two games are.
Alright, let's not waste any more time. It's finally time to get into the really good stuff. Starting off with... Case 6, The Adventure of the Blossoming Attorney. Before we begin, I should mention we'll be referring to the cases in the Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve as cases 6 through 10. I feel like these games' stories are so closely intertwined to the point where neither game fully has the ability to stand on their own as individuals. So it's better to treat the entire duology as a single package. It's very easy to just immediately pick up from where the previous case left off and jump straight into this one.
Which, to be fair, comes with its own set of drawbacks since this is still technically a tutorial case. If you do pick up this case immediately after finishing case 5, you will still have to be subjected to the usual tutorials teaching you how to press and present and look at the court record. And worse still, you don't really have the option to skip those bits. For whatever reason, the feature of looking at all your evidence in 3D is not something you're given the option to do off the bat. In order to find crucial bits of evidence, you need to scroll past the end of the second testimony in the game and hear Professor Mikitoba tell you how to examine evidence. You're not allowed to do that at all before he brings up the option, which makes it all the easier to miss the crucial evidence which you can only look into after that point. If you try examining it beforehand, you can be fooled into thinking there's nothing to examine in the first place. It's the one unignorable remnant of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles being a compilation of two games which were originally released separately. And now with that out of the way, I think that's about the full extent of the complaints we have on this case. This intro is actually better than any of the previous 5 cases we've just got done talking about.
First of all, just the basic premise of this case is fantastic right off the bat. Susato disguising herself as a boy in order to appear in court as a lawyer to defend one of her best friends in a murder trial. You hear that and you already know it's going to work. If not for that rule about women not being allowed to appear in court in that capacity, she'd already have better qualifications to practice law than Ryunosuke. And of course she's going under the alias Ryutaro Naruhodo and pretending to be his cousin. All immediately hype-inducing from the moment you see it. As for what circumstances led for such a situation to be necessary, well, of course, there's some more foreign affairs bullshit in the mix once again, as the victim of this case was Giselle Brett.
Side note, actually, can we talk about that? This point is another complaint we might have about the case. Giselle Brett was just killed off without having gotten the chance to actually do anything. Yet another point in this duology where it looked like they were setting up something more important and decide not to pay it off. You'd think her being all but let off the hook for a murder conviction would have resulted in further consequences later down the line, but they kinda just cut that possible storyline short in a fairly anticlimax way. Oh well, setting aside what could have been, at least the result of what we actually got in the case worked well enough to overlook that for the time being.
Anyway, the stakes are already pretty high considering who the victim is, but the witnesses seem to be more trustworthy than usual too. Both people we already recognize. Sosuke Natsume's back and apparently saw enough success as an author where he's built up a slight bit of an ego, although otherwise isn't that different. and Inspector Hosonaga has unveiled his latest foolproof disguise of tying a toy turtle to his head. Once partially submerged in the ocean, no one will ever be able to... Once partially submerged in the ocean, no one will ever be able to see him coming. Brilliant! Also, Payne is back as the prosecutor again, swearing revenge on the yokel student who humiliated him in court that one time, and hyped to challenge someone else from the Naruhodo clan. Also, he's apparently just learned the word yokel, since he uses it in every other sentence.
We also can't forget the defendant in this case, Susato's childhood friend Rei Membami, notable for possibly being the first Ace Attorney character to have written to be gay on purpose. John Armstrong doesn't count, as technically still possible to read that guy as straight. This character all but falls in love with Susato immediately upon seeing her disguised as a male student, and upon realizing her true identity. She may be surprised at first, but soon after just doubles down on how gallant and dashing her friend looks, and continues to not so subtly thirst after her for the rest of the case, even offering a date at the very end. There's not really any alternative way to interpret that. And I'm an Ace Aero guy who doesn't typically care to read into that kind of thing. At the barest minimum, it's the writer seeing the vast amount of queer subtext that the fanbase reads into every major character in this entire franchise, and deliberately winking to the audience like, ah, I see you. Shame for her that Susato may as well already be married at this point. Also a slight shame that Rei doesn't end up having any importance beyond this one case, which was slightly unexpected given how prominently she often appeared in this game's promotional art, but it is what it is.
There's also, of course, the killer, the over-energetic reporter writing many memo. There's not any kind of surprise with this guy. You kind of already suspect him from the moment you see him in the background snapping photos of Natsume, and I was fully expecting to find him really annoying right off the bat with how in-your-face he is. But as time went on, he ended up growing on me, and I low-key ended up finding him kind of fascinating. Guy is a total narcissist, and his philosophy of many memoism that he name drops all the time can easily be boiled down to fuck everyone in the name of journalism. But at the same time, I did also kind of find it interesting how completely shameless he is. The fact that he's not even trying to hide his complete disregard for ethics, and is even proud of it because every bit of his shitty behavior is just a part of following that personal philosophy. Yes, I stabbed the victim, and that's exactly why I'm innocent! Is the kind of statement that you'll only ever hear in an Ace Attorney game. But it's also kind of interesting how his philosophy includes a really intense sense of social justice. How much he wants to expose corruption and conspiracies and wants the shitty people who actually have power to get what's coming to them. There is some interesting depth to this guy that sets him apart from the usual fare for killers in the series. Snapping your suspenders like that so many times has to be painful though.
Now, this case was already very solid throughout, very straightforwardly hitting on all the notes we could possibly want an intro case to hit without giving us anything to complain about, featuring none of the padding issues that plagued the previous intro case or a number of other earlier cases in the Great Ace Attorney, but also never feeling boring or like it's just going through the motions as other intro cases in this series can. But what really cemented this case as one of the strongest intros in the series was a couple of moments right at the end. First of all, Many Memo's breakdown is one of the best goddamn breakdowns in this entire series. Susato and Rei rushing in to throw him across the courtroom was absolutely incredible the first time we saw it. Second of all, upon realizing he's been defeated by someone ostensibly from the Naruhodo clan yet again, Payne conducts a funeral for the last sprig of hair that grew on his forehead as direct symbolism for his finally losing hope in the future. Also incredible. But all of that is nothing compared to the last 5 minutes of the case, when Many Memo tries to escape the bailiffs and break into the courtroom lounge to confront Professor Mikitoba about all the things that happened to Kazuma on the steamship, when suddenly...
The judge decked a guy! The fucking judge decked a guy! I have no words! This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life!
This case may not technically hit the heights of intros like Turnabout Trump or Turnabout Target. It's not one of the greatest or deepest cases the entire series has ever had to offer in general, but it certainly does a lot to break away from our typical issues with intro cases and is just a really all-around fun time. And the breeziness of this case in comparison with how dragged out the finale of the previous game felt makes it the kind of thing we'd much more easily want to come back to. So yes, as mentioned before, this intro case is in fact better than all 5 of the cases in the first Great Ace Attorney, and in our overall ranking we'll be putting it exactly 1 spot above that game's finale, right below Turnabout Samurai.
Case 7. The Memoirs of the Clouded Kokoro. Okay, now it's time to get into the first case of the Great Ace Attorney 2 with some more meat on it. It's the first in the duology to follow the more traditional format of 2 investigations and 2 trials. And right off the bat, we're already operating on a noticeably higher level of quality than anything we've gotten in the first Great Ace Attorney. As you might guess in the title, it's a direct sequel to Case 4 in the previous game that takes place immediately after that one and before Case 5. Less than 24 hours after Sosuke Natsume was found not guilty of stabbing someone in the back, he's already found himself in the middle of another incident, this time poisoning his neighbor. And once again, the one who gets him in that hot water is Herlock Sholmes, making one of his usual deductions. Okay, not quite. Actually, the one who gets him in hot water is you! Ryunosuke has to correct Sholmes from accusing the victim of eating soap, but Natsume blames Sholmes for his unfortunate circumstances anyway, presumably since he knows Ryunosuke is the one guy most likely to actually help him out of the whole conundrum. Oh yeah, and it also turns out the victim is not actually dead. After all the deduction is over, he just stands up and starts talking as if nothing unusual happened. Cool.
I will say the intro of the case can be a little on the slow side, and there are more remnants of this duology being 2 separate games released 2 years apart from each other that start to work against it in this compilation format. It is weird that Susato offers a refresher on how to do summation examinations, despite them canonically having just been in court doing that 2 days ago, for instance. Also, if I'm being honest, the eating soap deduction is probably the least interesting deduction segment in the whole series. Pretty straightforward and tame compared to all the other similar segments, except for one mildly frustrating part where they assume you already remember you can examine things before presenting them, and forget to show you the option to do that in the bottom corner. Made frustrating in the last part of the deduction when examining something first is necessary to progress. Can we do the usual things before you tell us to do it or not, game? Make up your mind. Still, aside from that and maybe a few moments in the first trial where you have to present some of the same things you just presented twice in a row, that's about the full extent of the complaints we have on this case as well, which again is nowhere near as intrusive compared to other cases in the first Great Ace Attorney. Even that somewhat slower intro allows us to be reintroduced to Sholmes in a manner of speaking and get an out-of-nowhere extreme close-up.
There's not really much to note about the recurring characters, but nor is there anything to complain about. John Garadeb is back. He's unfortunately not nearly as much of a source of big laughs in this case, so much as he is just a source of exposition. But I do kinda like the fact that he doesn't even pretend to grandstand around you anymore now that he knows all his secrets are out in the open. Also funny when Sholmes randomly contributes to the random conversations with him when you didn't even know he was in the room before, and yet no one's surprised enough to acknowledge it. He's just randomly there and everyone just runs with it. Oh yeah, and there's a lot of cool forensic stuff he does, which is a neat addition.
You also got Gregson here again, and he honestly might be more straightforwardly easy to like in this case than he was in any previous appearance. There's not much in the way of grumbling about you beyond his usual judgmental stares at Sholmes. There's no terrified reactions at the presence of a 10-year-old. You just help him with the investigation, and in turn, he feels like he owes you something for it and helps you back, giving you important evidence to help your case. No laughs really, just kinda nice. Natsume is exactly as entertaining here as he is in any other appearance. The entire mystery revolving around his haunted lodgings is definitely intriguing, and focused on well enough to actually have some real tangible stakes. What previously seemed to just be borderline delusional ranting slowly starts to feel more real the more you find out about things. And it's also nice of him to provide the image of his visit to the victim's lodgings, in which they had a quite heated debate over tea about Romeo and Juliet and who is the strongest. And the two even got into costume to have a reenactment/wrestling match to decide the outcome. with Natsume dressed as Juliet winning, because of course Juliet would know the art of jujitsu, only logical, really.
God. Meanwhile, out of all the characters introduced in this case, there really isn't a bad one in the bunch. Maybe the least interesting ones are the gas company people, but when one of them is a guy with a comically gigantic chin who occasionally springs his entire head up and down like a bobblehead, and periodically stops the case for 5 full seconds multiple times to bow to his employer, and the other one is said employer, the wife of the owner of the gas company, who definitely doesn't just basically run the gas company herself, and who also happened to be selected for the jury because, of course. It's still a pretty decent showing, and the talk of how the victim came up with an elaborate scheme to get gas without paying for it is pretty interesting.
They're not favorites, and the guy's bowing gets to be a bit much, but they certainly don't drag things out to even close to the same extent as the police couple in Case 4. Also, side note, speaking of the jury, I don't have any idea on why they decided to make the entire rest of the jury just all the exact same people who were on the jury last time Natsume was the defendant. I thought the whole idea was that this is a new case and out to have people who can look at it from a fresh perspective. Anytime they bring up the fact that the jury is chosen at random is always kind of funny because that is very blatantly untrue. This isn't actually a complaint, mind you. Designing 6 entire new character models for each case would be quite difficult to pull off for many different reasons, and I don't blame them for reusing them when possible. It's just something kind of funny to note.
I don't really know why juror number 3 suddenly became way more of a dick than last time, though. At least he makes one face I like. But getting back on topic to new characters, there's 2 particularly big standouts. First of all, we have Olive Green, the artist woman who got stabbed in the back in Case 4, who we actually get to meet in person for the first time. At first, something about her just seems off. Talking to her at any point tends to be quite uncomfortable thanks to her unignorably intense self-loathing. She's going out of her way to put herself down and saying things like, "Oh, me regaining consciousness made all these doctors so much busier and on edge. I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have regained consciousness." Already, all of the yikes. But somehow, things even further escalate from there. At the end of the second investigation, you show up to the hospital to see her about to drink from a bottle that she says is medicine. I don't like where that could be going. And as you talk to her more about the details from the case at hand, which turn out to be more closely related to her than you'd think, what with her fiancé having died in mysterious circumstances in the same room that Natsume now occupies. She accidentally knocks over the bottle, a mouse comes along to drink from the spilled contents, and within minutes, it's dead. Oh, Jesus Christ, she was about to attempt suicide. Oh my God! Thankfully, though, you do successfully stop her, and she makes her first positive sentiment about how if she survived being stabbed in the back and a suicide attempt, then maybe she is destined to keep on living and see her life through to the natural end. But then even further twists come out through the second trial about how it turns out that she of all people was the real killer. Having suspected and sort of figured out the real truth of what happened and set up a trap with that poison in order to get revenge on the person who may have killed her fiancé. If it was an accident, no one would have been harmed. But if it was on purpose, the real killer would get his just desserts. I really have to say, all that darker subject matter and implications are handled really damn well. All her actions, behavior, and motivations line up and make perfect sense. And when she says thank you at the very end for helping her decide to choose to keep on living, it really is such a relieving burden off your shoulders. Very well done.
On a slightly less dark note, we've been Shakespeare dancing around the other big standout in this case.
God damn it.
The victim William Shakespeare, who himself turns out to be the true villain of the case, having killed Olive Green's fiancé through his gas pipe blowing scheme, and attempted to do the same to Natsume, creating the whole cursed lodgings mystery, thanks to having inherited the key to a treasure from a fellow prison inmate who was dying but unable to actually get access to the room where the treasure was hidden. Putting aside how clever and out of the box his actual schemes were and how surprisingly fun they are to untangle, just fucking look at this guy. Shakespeare-themed Ace Attorney villain sounds like it's one of those ideas that this series would have already done before now, and it's exactly as entertaining as it sounds. Also, I'm not entirely sure how they got a character with that obnoxiously gaudy a visual design and who literally has sham in his name to feel like a twist villain who you don't see coming, but somehow they did, so major kudos for that. At first you just see how this guy is really down on his luck financially and figure he's just a hapless loser not to be taken seriously, which is still very much true, but they keep surprising you with the extent to which all his various crimes actually reach. And of course, once again, just 10 out of 10 work from the motion capture actors for this guy. All the crazy dramatic movements and dances he makes are all hilarious and low-key mesmerizing to watch. Some of these animations just leave you wanting to pause and linger on his making everyone uncomfortable with his sham spear dancing. Especially right at the end as he really starts breaking down, makes incredible facial expressions like these. And finally...
Jeez, maybe we should start investigating if this video has a gas leak. But that leaves one last point to mention. The very ending of the case when Sholmes uncovers the treasure Shamspear was looking for. It turns out to be what looks like a giant dog collar, clearly very valuable, but also with weird blood stains. And Iris says that bee emblem on the front seems vaguely familiar, which leads Sholmes to immediately break character, hand the collar over to Gregson for police safekeeping, and demand Iris not publish the story of this case. It's the first really big bits of foreshadowing for those biggest mysteries to come regarding the overarching plot of the duology. Just chill-inducing stuff, which will only get more intriguing as we get into the next case. But yeah, that's about everything in this case we have to note. While sure, there are plenty of other side cases in this series that have left stronger impressions on us in the past, this is the first major case in the Great Ace Attorney where our complaints are mostly left at minor nitpicks, and the good so clearly outweighs the bad. There's no weird writing missteps or boring stretches holding this one back like there are for earlier cases. In other words, it's the first Great Ace Attorney case to show up in the top half of our ranking. We're putting it one spot above the Forgotten Turnabout and one spot below Turnabout Reminiscence. We've finally gotten into the really good stuff, and we're only going to see better from here. Case 8. The Return of the Great Departed Soul. Now, if you want the first case in the Great Ace Attorney which actually deserves to sit among some of the best in this franchise, it's going to be this one. The Great Departed Soul referenced in this case's title is obviously Ryunosuke himself, who after 6 months of having been disbarred from court, thanks to all the disseminating government secrets shenaniganry, has finally been given permission to work as a defense attorney again. A triumphant return indeed. And the latest case he is given permission to work on is a most curious incident at London's newly opened Great Exhibition, in which a scientist was showing off a practical demonstration of his fantastic new super high voltage instantaneous kinesis machine. I'm shocked I made it through that in one take. Which exploded and may or may not have killed the man in the process. We also get to see Sholmes more depressed than usual for some reason. We also get to find out that Von Zeeks got attacked and also has an apprentice for some reason who wears a mysterious hood and mask for some reason. And we get to meet Gina Lestrade again, who's apparently been taken in by Gregson as a police trainee and now refers to herself as Inspector Lestrade. She's even got a new police dog friend called Toby. Good for her. Nice to see her in a much happier place.
The scientist defendant in this case is named Albert Hairbrain, because of course he is, but he is definitely an interesting case in his own right. His status as a scientist puts a new twist on the usual expectations for meeting defendants in this series. There's never any difficult questions about whether or not he's worthy of your trust, since he's very upfront and genuine from the start. What you see is exactly what you get with that guy. His screwdriver is named Andrew. But the whole dilemma of trying to both get him off the hook for murder, as well as protect the privacy of his hypothesis, which is his entire life's work, and finding out these two goals may end up actively conflicting with one another thanks to his having been duped by two scoundrels who plan to use his experiment as a front to get their hands on the government's research grant money. The moral back and forth of whether to uphold your client's well-meaning wishes to further science with his grand hypothesis or expose the truth that his life's work, as well-meaning as it was fundamentally flawed from the start, and that the demonstration he put on was nothing more than staged trickery set up by his engineer. That's all very well done. Though an even more intriguing aspect to his character is the fact that it turns out he was university friends with Barak von Zieks. Seeing their dynamic with that long-standing personal history and mutual friendliness being quite obvious in spite of von Zieks prosecuting him for murder, does a lot more to humanize von Zieks than we've ever seen before. Harebrained also implies that the way von Zieks' personality has turned out in the specific way that it has may have been entirely the cause of a specific event in his past, although he doesn't know the details of that event. Wonder if we'll be finding out more about that in this case.
On a definitely completely unrelated note, as for why Sholmes was more depressed than usual in the beginning, it seems he has to miss the Great Exhibition thanks to taking on a bit of a side job for extra money as a temporary waxwork, pretending to be a model in a wax museum. As you do. After Iris gives him a good hearty kick to the groin, shortly afterwards we get to meet the woman who hired him and who runs the wax museum herself, Madame Tuspels. I'm just going to say it. This is one of my personal favorite side characters in the entire series. I find her absolutely fascinating. This is someone who is so incredibly good at making realistic wax models of people to the point of being a legit intimidating presence that no one dare fuck with. Not even the great Herlock Sholmes himself. Even if he may try. The deduction segment in which he nearly accuses her of selling one of her wax models when said model was actually stolen for ransom, and she actually clobbered some random guy unconscious for damaging another exhibit. Underrated moment for the case. She is so committed to absolute perfection in her wax models that she will go to any length to accomplish that realism, including that of her most famous special exhibit, a wax model of London's most famous serial killer, known only as the Professor, who it turns out she even went into the grave of immediately after the man was executed, in order to get an impression of the man's true face, which is otherwise a national secret. And she will face no repercussions for doing all that. Mainly because the gravedigger who was meant to bury the professor commissioned her to do it, and thus it was technically above board. But I like to think it's at least partially because everyone in the court system is too intimidated by her presence to even want to accuse her of a crime in the first place. Just hearing her talk about the extremely specific details of what goes into creating such a wax figure, including a talk about the onset of rigor mortis and needing to realign the dead man's jaw, may as well have just scared everyone straight, and that's amazing. Also, she's kinda hot.
But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The first trial also features an Italian hot air balloon guy nobody cares about and an angry bohemian prince nobody cares about. But most notably, at the very end, features the true reason this case is called The Return of the Great Departed Soul, and that great departed soul who makes a return is none other than Susato, who has come to chuck you into a wall for a perfectly timed moral support as you think you're about to hit your lowest point. Shortly after that, we get to catch up with her back in the office, where she finally reveals to Iris about how she knew about the Hound of the Baskervilles in the first place. But we still don't know why she was sent back to Japan either. Her father was in perfectly fine health and hadn't fallen ill at all. Not to mention she found out from many memo that Kazuma's body apparently vanished when it was supposed to be delivered from the steamship. And upon asking her father about these things, he refused to fill her in on any of the answers. More mysteries for later, I suppose. The investigation also sees us briefly meeting the creepy-looking coroner Courtney Scythe, who apparently bought a lot of scalpels or something like that, getting to talk to Von Zieks about his dead brother who was killed by the professor, and Susato recognizing Von Zieks' mysterious new apprentice, who she notes bears a strong resemblance to Kazuma. But he's suffering from amnesia, so I guess we don't technically know for sure, right? Hearing the name Kazuma seems to have rung a bell with the man, though. Oh, I bet it's nothing.
If all these suspicions are to be believed, though, that means Sholmes lied to them about Kazuma having been murdered in the first place. So we have to go and talk to the man who appears to be just as evasive about the matter as Susato's father was. but he does give you the opportunity to find out a bit more about the mysterious case of the professor after it comes to pass that it may be more relevant to the harebrained case at hand than expected. And this professor case is the true reason that this case is called The Return of the Great Departed Soul. As Madame Tuspel's special exhibit shows, this notorious serial killer allegedly came back from the dead, crawling out of his grave for a moment only to be shot dead once again. Could such a thing really be possible for that particular great departed soul to return in that particular horrifying way? Well, all of it was witnessed by a student of science out at the graveyard at the time, one Enoch Drebber, who, by the way, we may have failed to mention was also the engineer who built Harebrain's kinesis machine and collaborated with the victim, Odie Osman, to dupe the man. We still have yet to meet this Enoch Drebber in person, don't we? Well, good timing, because we got Gina's dog to track down the man's workshop, which leads to quite possibly the single best great deduction in the entire series, regarding a curious device which looks suspiciously like a time bomb, but Sholmes lets us know not to worry. It's nothing of the sort. It is rather an anti-gravity device, which is definitely not scientifically possible, and not just an excuse for Sholmes to fuck around with everyone and spout more bullshit for a solid 20 minutes. Prepare for the most incredible camera angles you've seen in this game thus far, overturned furniture with conspicuously noted safe combinations, and projectile shoes. Elementary, my dear fellow. It appears we have found this Enoch Drebber, man. It appears we have... Oh my god, I gotta calm down. It appears we have found this Enoch Drebber man inside his own safe. Oh, but he's letting us know that we should probably deactivate that bomb he sets. He kind of figured anyone who would come across it. He kind of figured anyone who would come across it would run away like a normal person instead of dancing around and spouting nonsense for ages. Clearly, you must be readying to die alongside him. Oh, Sholmes diffused it. We're good. Surely nothing could have been done to make that whole process smoother. Both in this whole process of the Great Deduction and me reading this goddamn line.
Enoch Drebber might be the single most memorable one-off villain that the Great Ace Attorney has to offer. His visual design and the way he moves around is definitely a significant part of that. If there was ever any remaining question of whether or not it makes sense for the Ace Attorney and Professor Layton franchises to take place in the same universe for that crossover to happen, I think the 1800s robot magician man all but clears that up quite decisively. But this duology has already never been slouching in terms of the visual designs for any given characters, regardless of whether or not you actually give a crap about them. Drebber also has the advantage of being written compellingly as well, not just his slightly ridiculous far-reaching talents in the fields of both science and stage magic, but also his well-established backstory of how his entire life had been screwed over by having witnessed something that no one should have ever been able to see, and how that intense bitterness led him down the specific criminal path that he went down actually makes perfect sense. All the way down to having designed this whole charade specifically for the purposes of revenge against those who wronged him, and especially the victim, who it turns out was also the one reporter who published the story of the professor rising from the grave while also naming Drebber specifically, thus being the entire impetus for the man's life having been completely derailed. But of course he was also the man who stole the waxwork of the professor from Madame Tuspel's to directly use as part of the whole charade. And his reason for doing such a thing was to get revenge on and also coerce a certain high-level coroner into going along with his plans.
Courtney Scythe is one of those characters who I wouldn't have necessarily thought much of the first time we played this game. Like, I guess her design looks kinda evil, but it's not nearly as much in the fun way as Drebber. She's not one to ever show much emotion, aside from maybe this one shocked expression that looks pretty genuine, but you don't see that often. Credit to her theme song though, which does actually give me chills sometimes. She's the kind of presence who you're just always uneasy around, and finding out she has this dark secret of having knowingly signed a fake autopsy for the professor and directly participated in this giant government cover-up. In hindsight, it's probably not that big of a surprise just off the fact she's introduced in this case at all, and looks like that in the first place, but revealing her as an accomplice still feels like a pretty major twist thanks to her never really being in the forefront of your mind. She does inform you at the beginning of one trial segment that Lord Notgant himself has forbidden her from appearing in court for this case. But Von Zieks later decides to just go against that order and bring her in anyway. And that moment feels like the true reason that this case is called The Return of the... No, not really. That's a stretch. But it's neat how many other different thematic parallels this case's title actually carries.
Now, Dr. Scythe is a fine enough side villain, and it is by her final admission of all the things that came to pass that Ryunosuke finally has the opportunity he needs to get his client off the hook. But her admission does come a little out of nowhere, almost like an attempt to end the trial prematurely before all the lingering questions are answered. Which of course Ryunosuke is not going to just stand for. Trials are about finding the whole truth. And thus we get to the even bigger twist that becomes clear from the inconsistencies in her testimony that she's not just the side villain, she's the true killer. The one who actually stabbed the man and did so out of purely self-serving reasons. What with Mr. Asman having separately blackmailed her over that professor secret. Can I just say, it is refreshing after all these instances in this duology of attempts to subvert your expectations that end up feeling more like an anticlimax that kills off possible setup, for subversion of expectations like this, which is actually this successful without undercutting any of the other ongoing plot lines. Drebber is still the mastermind, and his status as the obvious villain that he is remains, so it's not like you're deprived of the satisfaction of taking him down. But him being so obvious, also serving as such a big distraction to misdirect your attention away from an equally well-established other villain, who's just as much if not even more of a direct threat, just like a magician using sleight of hand, that's really clever and well done.
And that leaves only the final scene to talk about, as after all the truth of the case is laid bare for all to see and Harebrained is finally acquitted, Von Zieks summons Ryunosuke and Susato into the courtroom to talk to him in private. The man finally confides in them about his relationship with the Japanese as a race, and how initially he was friendly with them, having met 3 of them through an international exchange program, one of which was Susato's father. However, Von Zieks also uses this opportunity to show them the true face of the professor, the man who killed his brother, unlocking the mask on the wax model to reveal the face of a Japanese man. Another one from the group of 3 he met before, kind of explaining not only how Von Zieks developed such vocal bitterness for the Japanese in general, but also more specifically why he cites betrayal as a source of those feelings.
Now, I'm personally not entirely sure how to feel on this point. If this entire plotline with Von Zieks was intended to make a greater point on real-life racism, I don't think the point being made is all that salient. It's once again an active malice thing in his case and not an ignorance thing, and I think resentment towards one person from another race ostensibly murdering their loved ones is probably not the most common source of racist attitudes in people. This obviously isn't to say the way they went about his story is unbelievable or unrealistic by any stretch, or that I think they handled it poorly. The circumstances that led to his attitude were pretty unusual, but it made sense for him to have the reaction to it that he did, and the fact that racism was so socially acceptable in those days definitely had to play into how easy it became for Von Zieks to fall into that mental trap of tarring all Japanese people with the same brush. The way it feels like he's starting to realize the errors in his ways and begin a redemption arc here, that's all good, works narratively, isn't putting out any objectionable ideas. I just don't think there's any special point being made through his character arc beyond a fairly generic and unchallenging racism bad message, and it doesn't make for all that deep or thought-provoking social commentary. Not that it needed to go any further than that in the first place, or that I'd ever expect Ace Attorney to be equipped to tackle that kind of subject matter more in depth, when it's already kind of out of the series' usual wheelhouse to be acknowledging it all. This isn't really a criticism so much as it is just kind of a neutral observation. It's just a thing that's there.
But Von Zieks' backstory isn't the most important takeaway here. The entire case has finally been leading up to one final reveal at the very end. Not that Kazuma's alive. Honestly, I think that was pretty easy to start suspecting just from the knowledge that the case is called The Return of the Great Departed Soul. But yeah, he's alive. He's been unmiya'd. Great to see. They have a nice emotional reunion that's exactly as impactful as you'd hope. But the actual new important information to reveal at this very point, the catalyst for Kazuma to get his memories back, is that he recognizes the face of the professor as being none other than his own father. The seeds of even more sinister things to come have been planted as Ryunosuke returns Kazuma's trusted katana to him, and the man leaves without much else in the way of other discussion. Even if you might have had a good idea where this case was going from the start, they make sure this ending hits you as hard as possible, and gets you even more pumped to see where things might be heading next for this finale. Overall, this is a case that just leaves us with so little to complain about. Sure, there exists plenty of other cases in this series that can hit even greater heights and hit on much deeper emotional levels, but this is easily the case that got us the most excited and consistently invested in the duology thus far. Had the most depth to it, with all these different moving parts and separate plot lines coming together really well in such an intriguing and unique way, with almost every new character leaving a big impact in their own separate ways, and all the reoccurring characters getting to see new developments. And in spite of it being the second longest individual case in the duology, doesn't feel its length at all. It's just all around top tier Ace Attorney, and in the ranking, this can go above our biggest guilty pleasure favorites in Rise from the Ashes and Recipe for Turnabout, but below the Magical Turnabout. It's also our favorite case in all of Great Ace Attorney, which, yes, does mean we like this more than the last two cases to come. Not to say those aren't also great, but, well, let's just get into our feelings on them now. Case 9, Twisted Karma and His Last Bow.
Alright, it's time to get into the duology's finale. Much like how Dual Destinies ended in two cases that are directly interconnected to the point of barely being able to stand on their own as individuals, the Great Ace Attorney's last two cases are basically one and the same as well. Although much in the same way as we did with 5-4 and 5-5, we're still going to be talking about both cases as separate entities anyway. And of course, first, we have to get into the case with all the setup, which, boy, is there a lot of setup to go through. It does take a while for the case to really get started, though there are a few interesting things of note before the case is introduced proper, such as how we start out with Professor Mikitoba and Judge Dugoku arriving in London for the scientific symposium and meeting with Ryunosuke and Susato to talk about a number of important things, including their memories of Kazuma's father and the old professor case, as well as the fact that Kazuma is still alive and well in London, which neither of them had any idea about. Meanwhile, Sholmes is up to his shenanigans as well. We meet two whiny redheads nobody cares about getting arrested by Gina Lestrade. We see Sholmes with his hair dyed bright red for the sake of an investigation, for which he mentions he'd been immediately recognized as being in disguise the moment he arrived. And we also meet a woman who was on the jury for the last case talking to Sholmes about her husband who has gone missing for a day, a man by the name of Daily Vigil who works as a prison warder. Or at least, as we found out, used to. According to the Scottish prison governor, Vigil hasn't worked there since the professor case went down 10 years ago. Interesting timing.
But we can't have an Ace Attorney case without a real murder happening right now. And boy is it a big one. Gina bursts into Sholmes' suite to announce just that. Clearly more visibly distraught than we've ever seen her before and unable to contain herself as she announces that Inspector Gregson, of all people, has been found dead, and that the man arrested as the primary suspect is none other than Barak von Zieks. This is probably the heaviest emotional moment we've gotten to date for Gina, and she becomes more of an emotional center for this case than she had at any previous point in the duology. With her deep respect for Gregson thanks to his having gotten her out of the gutter, as it were, and her shock at his passing carrying through so heavily through the entire rest of the game, as she'll later violently react to hearing any bad word about the man who extended such kindness to her. But she's not the only strong emotional center of this case, because surprisingly enough, someone who starts slotting in that role is none other than Von Zieks himself. For a guy whose shtick this whole time has been giving you shit for no reason other than Japanese, now that he's been accused of actual murder and his reputation as the Reaper the Bailey has caught up with him, he starts to actually let his guard down in front of you and speak to you completely frankly without any of the usual venom. Obviously, not to say he's thrilled to be working or talking with you in the first place, but with enough pressing, he does let slip the fact that he does actually genuinely respect Ryunosuke and believe him to have absolute integrity as a lawyer. He never have admitted it before, considering he fully believed the same thing of another Japanese man before, Genshin Ashogi, only to find that man guilty of murdering several members of the aristocracy, including his own brother. A deep-seated betrayal of the worst kind that understandably fueled all his previous behavior, even to the point where 10 years ago he successfully convinced not Gant to let him prosecute the professor case himself. So to finally be pressed into such a corner where he feels like he needs to ask Ryunosuke directly to defend him in court for this trial that will not just be about this one murder, but also examine the source of the entire Reaper of the Bailey mystery and thereby put his entire life, reputation, and career into Ryunosuke's hands. That's a fantastic moment as well.
Oh yeah, and speaking of Genshin Asogi, it seems there's been a full circle moment for this present case as well, as the man assigned to the prosecution is none other than Kazuma, who'd personally convinced not Gant to be able to prosecute the prosecutor who sent his own father to the gallows, just as Von Zieks did for the professor case 10 years ago. It seems this is also where the twisted karma part of the case's title comes from, as through the trial, it appears they are now trying to present Kazuma as a villain, dun dun dun. Once his best friend giving him moral support, Kazuma now does everything in his power to stand in Ryunosuke's way for the sake of his own personal revenge quest on the man he perceives to have so greatly dishonored his family's good name. This sounds like a really interesting twist on paper, and the way Kazuma is able to turn around his experience as a defense attorney into this new perspective as a prosecutor is pretty clever. But something about the way his heel turn's been executed feels kinda off. I don't think there's any part of the path that got Kazuma to that particular point that doesn't make logical sense. His steadfast motivation to find out the truth about his father feels real, and they sufficiently explain how he got to the point he did in a scene later in the case where he and Ryunosuke talk on their own in Von Zieks' office. But still, something about this part of his character arc feels slightly contrived in a way that I can't really put my finger on. Yes, I realize the irony of calling this aspect of his arc a little contrived right after he's just gotten a Fast and the Furious-style resurrection from the dead. I could roll with that, and this was the part I took issue with instead. But it's hard to say why exactly. I think it might just be the way it's presented, since they're trying to make this big deal about how he's changed so much to the point where he almost seems like a different person, that the man you once thought could be a hero has now become a twist villain complete with big bombastic villain theme music. And I don't really buy Kazuma as a villain, per se, or even think he's really changed all that drastically. Guy even said it himself that Ryunosuke is the one who changed over time and not him. We'll get into his arc a lot more later when we talk about Case 10, but just sticking to the way he acts in Case 9, he doesn't really do or say anything unreasonable or villainous. He seems to mostly be acting the same as we knew him before. He definitely leans into the theatrics sometimes, but he kinda did that in Case 1 as well. It's just his target is different now. Maybe he can sometimes feel like he's already just made up his mind about the truth of the case and is pursuing these predetermined conclusions to the point of getting tunnel vision, which might be getting ahead of ourselves a bit too, since it's not as obvious a point here as it is in the next case, but again, we'll get to that. As of now, the vast majority of what he says in court does feel perfectly valid enough. Ordinarily, I might even think that Kazuma slotting himself behind the prosecutor's bench should just be a good thing, as Ryunosuke gets to work with his closest and most trusted friend. Though, that's not quite how it plays out either. There is definitely some truth to the point of him having changed. The entire time in this case we deal with Prosecutor Kazuma, there is always a subtle feeling of wrongness, and like we're seeing a previously unseen side to his character. He is certainly way more antagonistic and pissed off here than he ever was before, but I don't know, it's not necessarily shocking. It makes sense given how personal the stakes are for him and how Case 1 already established he tends to be more dogged and driven, but also more narrow-minded than Ryunosuke. It's just kinda off-putting in an unspecific way, and not in a way that feels true to how the game is trying to hype him up.
Well, at least on a somewhat lighter note, there are plenty of witnesses to talk about in this trial. On one hand, the first group of witnesses, the 3 peddlers from Fresno Street, I had a lot of fun with. They were all great. You got Gossip, the energetic guy who sells tidbits of, well, gossip to passersby, and is always trying to put on this whole tough guy act that nobody buys or even acknowledges. He also at one point notes that he thinks Von Zieks has, and I quote, a face that screams bored. Put that on the list of all-time great out-of-context Ace Attorney lines. You got the return of Beppo from Case 3, although now everyone calls him Sandwich, and he acts like a deep philosophical thinker or something. And he'll always be the first to point out when his fellow peddlers are stretching the truth, despite also having stolen some evidence himself. Oh, and speaking of stretching the truth, that leaves the lady who sells firecrackers called Venus, most notable for being even more blatantly dishonest than most Ace Attorney witnesses, with absolutely no shame. She runs a whole scam where she sells firecrackers to kids to blow up their school, then secretly snitches to their teachers so that they confiscate the firecrackers, possibly getting a bonus for uncovering the kids' bad behavior, and the kids just come around to buy more firecrackers and the cycle continues. Absolutely incredible. Oh, and she also flat out admits to barefaced lies being her thing. And every other sentence from there on is a lie that requires either Kazuma or Ryunosuke to yell at her to tell the actual truth, which turns out to be nothing like what she said before. Fantastic all around.
Now, on the other hand, you also got the second pair of witnesses brought in afterwards, Fabian de Rousseau and Peppino de Rossi, the self-proclaimed Hilarious brothers, who were also the same redheads that Sholmes was investigating in the very beginning for their whole Red-Headed League scheme. These guys suck. It's been a while since we've gotten witnesses in the Great Ace Attorney that fell this flat, not since maybe the police couple back in Case 4, but man, neither of us laughed a single time with these two. There's no depth to their character beyond the most boringly predictable and played out lull France and lull Italy shtick, or the fact that the Italian one admits to everything illegal they did the moment he's asked about anything, which still obviously isn't as funny as Venus's whole shameless lie thing not even 10 minutes ago. And they stick around for a really long time, too. They're not as completely pointless or nondescript as the old man Korikuta from the first case. There is at least a clear purpose to having these guys around, and there is technically more depth to them, like how both grew up filthy rich and basically just do this scam stuff for shits and giggles. Also, apparently because people made fun of their red hair at school, which led them to target other people with red hair for their scam? I don't know, nobody cares. Old guy with the coin had way less relevance, but these two are way more of an active headache. Not because the stereotypes were offensive or anything. If anything, I feel like it would have been better if they'd leaned even further into the ridiculousness and gone even more over the top with it. This duology's been great at that otherwise. We literally just had the Skulkin brothers a few cases ago, who were basically doing the same bumbling, non-threatening criminal shtick a million times better. Now with these two, it just feels like the writers got lazy, like they expect just the accents alone and the fact that one of them just pulls out a plate of pasta from out of nowhere sometimes would be enough to get laughs, and give me a fucking break. I expect better than that from Ace Attorney. In retrospect, you can probably switch out an honorable mention spot on our worst characters list to make room for these guys.
At least there's a lot of important information to come out of their testimonies, which you can't very well just cut out. See, these guys had a run-in with Inspector Gregson, who had supposedly been investigating their scam, or at least someone claiming to be him. From what they say, the man they met looks nothing like the real Gregson we know. However, one of the guys stole the ID the imposter was flashing, and it is genuinely Gregson's ID. Combined with some neck bruising as another clue, it turns out the man they came across was Gossip from earlier. And while the two redheads don't recognize him as the detective they saw, they did see him renting out a room. The very same room where the murder took place, in fact. But that room also has a picture of his wife, by which we can deduce that Gossip's true identity is not a street peddler at all, but rather the former prison warder who went missing in the beginning of this case, Daily Vigil, who it turns out Gregson had been paying to impersonate him and show his ID to establish an alibi for himself. But as shocking as all that is, that leads us to the climax of this trial and the single most impactful and gut-wrenching moment of this entire case. You see, Vigil was fired from the prison 10 years ago, and of course, what else would line up with that timing-wise but the execution of the professor, of Cosmo's father. Vigil may have completely blocked out his memory of the time, and the professor case doesn't seem related to the actual case at hand, but Cosmo immediately jumps at the opportunity to hear more about the circumstances of his father's death, acknowledging that uncovering Vigil's memories may cause the man serious mental harm, but it must be done anyway in order to pursue the truth. Probably the closest Cosmo's come to doing anything actively villainous. This is a man who needs some kind of modern day medicine and or therapy and not be forced through this. But Ryunosuke still agrees to it as well because they are in a court of law. With further pressing, Vigil's memories slowly return. He remembers the prisoner escaped somehow, and then he remembers that the whole escape plot had been blamed on him as the chief warder. And as we watch the flashback of him processing that he's become the fall guy for an incredible state crime, we see the camera slowly pan over to the nearby window, and... fuck. Just no words for that. This duology on average may not have been hitting the hardest emotionally by the standards of the rest of the Ace Attorney franchise, but holy fuck is nobody gonna be able to forget a moment like that. That's gotta be up there with the death of Terry Fowles in terms of the most immediately nightmare-inducing shit Ace Attorney has ever given us.
That could be an absolutely insane cliffhanger ending to leave off on, but that only happens 2/3 into this case, with one more entire full investigation to come afterwards, which Iris tags along for. There's plenty more to get through, including above-mentioned conversations with Kazuma and Von Zeeks. The latter talks more about the whole Reaper of the Bailey business, and I forgot to mention earlier, before the trial he let slip that out of the 19 defendants he prosecuted which were acquitted, 16 died in mysterious circumstances, and only the 3 we've personally met in Gina, Natsume, and Hairbrain remain alive. Which is a figure that I really think we should have been told about way back in Case 4 when we were first informed about the whole Reaper thing in the first place. Would have really helped to establish some better stakes for this mystery, which, before being told this fact, may as well not matter at all. Not a single time the Reaper did his work, as it were, is on screen in the game or happens to someone that any of the main characters know or meet personally. All the defendants that Ryunosuke defended got away fine, except for McGilded, who was coincidentally killed by Edgar Benedict. Before being told that number, there would have been absolutely no narrative reason to take any stock in the Reaper mystery at all, beyond being some vague rumor that came about because Von Zeeks looks scary or something. I guess better to define the stakes late than never. But more on topic, in the last leg of this case, he reveals that he's been personally investigating all these deaths by the hand of the Reaper, and he believes they're the work of an organization rather than a single individual. He has 2 names he believes to be key members. The first, Tobias Gregson himself, acting as the tactician and planning out assassinations, using the Fresno Street room as a sort of secret base for operations, and the second, the actual assassin, one Asashin, better known to us as Giselle Brett. Again, bit of a missed opportunity that she's dead and not still more of an active looming threat, but whatever.
And there's plenty more people to talk to for more pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. We get to talk to Mikitoba more about his memories of the Professor case and working under the late Dr. Wilson, as well as noting how Judge Jigoku apparently smashed a witness stand during the Professor trial. I bet that would have looked amazing if we got to see it, huh? We meet Daily Vigil again as he recovers in the hospital and talk to him more about the minor details surrounding the worst day of his life. We talk to the prison governor, Barry Caden, again. Should probably mention him again, since he gets a decent amount of screen time in this case, though there really isn't much to say about him. He's nice enough on the surface, he was kinda friends with Mikitoba, he hands out rock-hard handcuff-shaped biscuits to visitors, and he's very Scottish.
And very skittish. Guy is quick to get self-defensive about things and can't maintain a poker face to save his life, especially when the topic of the Professor comes up. Skittish Scottish, one could say.
The slightly more interesting new character would be Maria Gori, the coroner for this case and the daughter of Courtney Scythe. Not much to say about her either, but I really like how they differentiate her personality from her mom. Scythe was all business and no emotion, but Gori is just extremely into being a coroner and cutting open corpses for autopsies, and really wants to talk to people about her special interest. She's clearly grown up around dead bodies, is totally comfortable around them, and even talks about living humans she meets as live specimens. Creepy as shit, but uniquely charming, in a similar way to Madame Two-Spells. We also find out while talking to her that the autopsy of the Professor's last victim, Clint Von Zeeks, has gone missing somehow, and that the last person who talked to her about it was Sholmes, of course. Upon hearing this, Iris remembers she has something else to do and runs off. The only other thing to mention in this part of the investigation is a quick conversation with Gina about Gregson's green suitcase which she found. That ends in Gina's dog jumping on Ryunosuke to lick the crap out of him, and thereby knock him unconscious. As you do.
Anyway, one last scene for the very end of this case. We've been getting a lot of super heavy and dark talk about assassinations and prison escapes and serial killers. We might need some more levity to balance things out. And what better way to do that than with one last great deduction? I think my brother over there mentioned that the anti-gravity device was his favorite deduction segment, but this one might be my favorite because, fuck, are you not emotionally prepared for it, and does it go places you would just never expect? And you'd already be hyped from the moment it starts. You just walk in to hear German singing, an unknown visitor wearing a tablecloth and Kazuma's mask sprawled out on the couch, various broken teacups, and Iris standing in the middle of the room completely silent. Sholmes' deduction? The visitor must be the King of Germany! He must be the one constantly singing German without even moving his mouth and with a gramophone right behind him. And Iris is silent because she broke his favorite coffee cup. Oh, life isn't worth living anymore. As for the real reason things played out the way they did, it partially involves that big wooden chest that's been sitting in the middle of the room since we came here the first time. And I have to tell you, the first time I found out what was inside... I actually started screaming out loud and inadvertently let everyone in the entire house know of my feelings. Just repeatedly scream laughing, "What the fuck?" for like 5 minutes straight. That was a good time.
But as for the real identity of that non-King of Germany visitor, that's just Professor Mikotoba. Wait, what was he doing here in the first place, and why did he try to open the chest? No matter. As for Iris' secret, apparently she's the one who actually stole the autopsy for Clint von Zieks from Dr. Gory's office. She recognized the handwriting on it as her father, who wrote all those old stories of his adventures with Sholmes, and pieced together that Sholmes' great partner and her own father, therefore, must have been Dr. John H. Wilson, hence the surname she's chosen. Although, wait a second. Susato then also reads the von Zieks autopsy and realizes she immediately recognizes the handwriting on it as well. It's her father's. Wait, what does this mean? It makes sense since Mikotoba did work under Dr. Wilson at the time and already mentioned working on that autopsy. But as we're in the middle of processing that, the case ends in another mind-blowing revelation. Sholmes' great friend and partner then regains consciousness to speak to them again. Yes, all this time, it was never Sholmes and Wilson, but rather Sholmes and Mikotoba. That also admittedly leaves the real Dr. Wilson in a bit of a Rex QB position, as we now realize he's not nearly as important a figure as we once thought, and is thereby reduced to a generic plot device. And the revelation also leaves some open questions about Iris' parentage, which Mikotoba immediately shuts down as not meaning what you think it does. But before he can explain himself, Sholmes informs him that there's a new adventure that they must be going on. Come, Mikotoba, the game is afoot!
And thus ends Twisted Karma and his last bow. Holy crap, is that a lot, and that's just the setup case to lead us into the true finale. I mean, as far as near finale cases go, it might be a bit hit and miss, and the way it all comes together is a bit messy, but it definitely delivers on the scale you want out of Ace Attorney finales, with some typically insanely dark shit to go through, and twists and turns and laughs and scares and more. The previous case could admittedly hit on a comparable level of excitement while getting all its scattered parts to fit together a lot more cohesively. There's definitely lots of parts we have more mixed feelings on here, where the last case was a lot more consistent, but it's still just the kind of roller coaster ride the lead up to an Ace Attorney finale should be, with several of the best individual moments in the entire duology. So, in the old ranking, we're willing to put this one above Turnabout Academy and below Rise from the Ashes.
Case 10. The Resolve of Ryunosuke Naruhodo. Now that we've gotten through all the setup, it's time to talk about how everything is paid out. Fuck. It's time to talk about how everything is paid off. The whole duology is leading up to this moment, aiming to show the answers to all these lingering questions that have been left open, solving the mysteries of the Reaper of the Bailey, of the Professor case from 10 years ago, and anything else that you've possibly been left hanging on. It's pretty much all trial with one very short break for investigation near the beginning, and if you know what you're doing, it can actually breeze by pretty quickly and feel like one of the shorter finale cases this series has given us. But only if you know what you're doing. It's also easily the most difficult of the cases to get through, and I got stuck on nearly every other testimony in the case, trying to figure out how to progress. Which makes sense, given the scale we're operating on at this point. Mysteries left unsolved for 10 years aren't just going to immediately solve themselves. Especially not when we've got a new judge for this trial, and it's not Gant again, is it? You're as subtle as ever, I see. We'll get to him in a bit.
So the beginning of this case is mainly concerned with pinning down the real circumstances behind Gregson's death, and the mystery of the Reaper the Bailey, of which he's such an integral part of. Even if, as I went over earlier, this mystery doesn't have the emotional stakes it probably should, there is a lot of good stuff here, with Gina Lestrade in denial that her boss could be so corrupt and contributing to all these assassination missions. Also, after she testifies the first time, this one particular running joke reaches its peak. But it comes to pass in this segment that the actual scene of Gregson's murder was that of the steamship SS Grouse, that he'd been on a mission for the assassination of Judge Jigoku of all people. And on top of that, someone let slip they know a little bit too much about the real circumstances of Gregson's death. None other than Kazuma of all people. It doesn't take much pressure for Kazuma to admit to having signed up for that very same assassination mission and act as an assassin to accompany Gregson, even if he maintains he never killed anyone or planned to do so in the first place. Judge Jigoku did obviously turn out to be perfectly alive and well when we met him earlier.
Although additionally, we later get a not really investigation segment in Sholmes' suite, where he explains how he intercepted that one secret message with the 4 names from the end of Case 5, and discusses how he's come to realize that the message was meant to organize an assassin exchange, in which Asa Shin, aka Giselle Brett, would kill John Wilson, and Kazuma would be sent to kill Gregson. That the latter was the real target, and Jigoku was actually the one who partially organized the whole affair. Gosh, are they setting up Ryunosuke's great friend to be the true killer? It almost starts to feel like a mirror of the revelations behind Godot at the end of Trials and Tribulations. You don't want it to be him, but you have to consider... Gosh, not Gant's gavel sure makes a loud noise, doesn't it?
Yeah, so you know how we were talking about Kazuma not being convincing as a villain in the previous case? That still stands here as well. The game is still trying to get you to doubt him and second guess yourself about his character, and it doesn't really work. When he says that he only took on the assassination mission as a ruse, you know he's telling the truth. It's obvious all he wanted was to get more info on the death of his father, which Gregson could and did provide him with. And we haven't been given a reason not to take Kazuma at his word. Not just because that'd be more in line with his character, but especially considering there's other villains right next to him which are clearly much more of an obvious threat. I don't know whether or not there was really an attempt to get his character to mirror Godot, but in either case, that comparison can't hold because they never actually go through with it. As far as side villains created as a distraction from the main one, though, there is another one which ends up slotting in that role a fair bit more effectively. Though, we have to actually find him first, don't we?
Arguably, the most memorable moment of this entire case is the duology's final great deduction segment, in which Sholmes and Mikotoba have gotten on the very steamship where Gregson was alleged to have been killed in order to pin down Judge Jigoku's true whereabouts. This segment is amazing for several different reasons, not the least of which is just getting to see the dynamic between Sholmes and Mikotoba playing out in real time, complete with Mikotoba tap dancing, absolutely amazing. But it also ends up being a much bigger clue as to Sholmes' true character as well. There's no fooling around in this deduction or weird slip-ups or distractions like there usually are. He just already saw through to the heart of the matter and is uncharacteristically getting straight to the point while investigating this model swap, brother of that guy from the other steamship case.
How could you know this?
The implication from this segment and the way he behaves through the rest of the case is that Herlock Sholmes really is exactly the genius that he has the reputation to be, and that all this time he's been spouting complete bullshit in other great deductions. It's just been a ruse to get Ryunosuke or whatever other applicable person to think for themselves more, as well as presumably to actively fuck with them out of boredom. Absolutely amazing. Also, so much hype. Anyway, we find Judge Goku hiding in his own suitcase, and thus it's time to take him to task as a villain.
Making a Judge the real killer is definitely a new twist this series hasn't done before, which we do have to give them credit for. We definitely did not see him coming, especially not from how endearing and likable they made him before. With that said, while he is an effective distraction, I don't know if I'd say he's the strongest of villains this series has ever given us. Not to say he isn't a credible threat, or that all the various treacheries he's revealed to have committed aren't serious enough, both with the assassin exchange and with his direct involvement in the Professor case revealed later, with him having been the one who pulled the trigger to kill Genshin Asogi in his grave. But despite all the scummy ways he tries to get himself out of it on the stand, there's still this weird sense after all these revelations that he's still not the real bad guy in this story. Yes, that is partially because he's obviously not the primary threat and that all his actions came out of someone else manipulating him. But they may have also made him a little too endearing to be as believable in the villain role as he could be. The guy just cannot make a poker face to save his life, and every single piece of evidence you bring up against him has him reacting in such an intensely physical way that I can practically imagine him talking like Old Man Joseph Joestar. Oh my god! Again, solid character, enjoyable presence. His breakdown where we get to see him smashing the witness stand in action is fantastic too, but as far as being a villain, he's just okay and not outstanding.
With all that out of the way, there's still more mysteries surrounding the old Professor case to be resolved. In direct contrast to the Reaper mystery, which didn't feel as urgent as it was trying to be, the Professor case has been much better established and given much higher emotional stakes. That's the kind of case that gets everyone connected to it to go cold and start acting completely differently from how they normally behave. And it's no wonder why. Several people dying from being attacked by a giant hunting dog who would tear their throats apart is already one of the scariest images Ace Attorney has ever put in our minds. And the extent to which it was covered up and how that led to so many other state-sanctioned crimes being committed and livelihoods being destroyed, most obviously in Daily Vigil's case, is nothing short of horrifying in its own right. Side note, it is low-key kinda neat to see Vigil just no longer giving a crap in this case, saying to Governor Caden's face that he doesn't forgive him for any of the things he's done, as well as baiting him into physically picking him up and shaking him around. That's fun. But there's deeper revelations to come surrounding the Professor case, with even higher stakes. Just as Kazuma suspected, his father is not the true identity of the Professor, but nobody was ready for the Professor to be identified as none other than Clint von Zieks, a man believed by the public to be the paragon of justice, a member of the aristocracy himself, and one of the world's greatest prosecutors, driven to do these unspeakable things to the people he believed to be a cancer on the society he lived in. The revelation of this horrifying truth leads to a rare emotional outburst from his still-living brother, unable to believe that the man he looked up to all his life could have done such things. Even if the decision to make one of the least emotional characters in this duology carry the emotional center of this part of the case is kind of strange, and the man is only capable of expressing so much, the heaviness of this moment is still consistently felt anyways.
Now, this reveal in itself might have had the capability to reduce Genshin Asogi to plot device status, fall for the same trap as John Wilson, where this character you thought carried a certain kind of importance end up barely mattering at all in the service of a bait and switch. But thankfully, Asogi's importance to the story isn't undercut by that. He's still the man who killed Clint von Zieks and ended the Professor's reign of terror, but choosing to let him go out with what would then be considered an honorable death in the duel, and letting the man write out a full last will and testament as a confession. And it was also that very confession that ended up used as the final trap to ensure justice could be served against the one who manipulated Clint into becoming the professor, cleverly hidden inside the hilt of his own sword, which has been sitting at either Ryunosuke or Kazuma's side through the entire length of both games. There may still be a little part of me who wishes Genshin Isogi had been established a little better and, I don't know, maybe name-dropped earlier in the duology, if only for something to give Kazuma's arc better emotional grounding. We don't know much about Genshin Isogi until near the very end of the game, and even Kazuma himself admits at one point that he didn't get to know his father as well as he wanted to, thanks to him dying while he was still so young. But in the grand scheme of things, this is much more of a minor thing, like a passive wish rather than an active problem. They still handled his character well enough to get it to work, and the small bits we do know of the man seem pretty badass.
And that leaves one last character to talk about who we've been dancing around. As it turns out, all the tragedies throughout the entire case, the Reaper, the Professor, and all the stuff in between has been controlled and manipulated behind the scenes by one singular foreboding figure that's twisting all of the events to his own benefit. The true mastermind and final boss of the entire Great Ace Attorney duology, and as for who that man is? Who do you fucking think? Okay, we're going to have to finally address the not Gant in the room. Strongheart is a character we're somewhat conflicted on. When it purely comes to playing the role of the final boss, he's solid, well established as a threat, and always an intimidating presence. I'll even give him credit for being an interesting portrait for the dictionary definition of a Machiavellian. Someone who does all these evil things and manipulates all these people for what he perceives to be the better of his country, and in such a way where his motivations even make sense. All the people killed by the Reaper were criminals that manipulated the justice system themselves, and the members of the aristocracy killed by the Professor were also doing unspeakable things to the common people of Britain. As such, he still has supporters willing to defend his tactics even after all his crimes have been exposed. That's all cool. He even has one of the series' coolest looking breakdowns. The problem, of course, is that he's way too fucking obvious. You already know he's going to be the final boss from the very moment you see him on screen. He's just designed to look like a final boss, and there's no twist or surprise. He's exactly the kind of person you think he is from initial appearances. In the original Japanese version, his name could be translated as Hurt Vortex, as if you didn't need his evilness beaten into your head enough. And all his resemblances to Damon Gant in particular only add insult to injury, because not only does the similarity feel really on the nose with the really similar hairstyle and body shape to the point where Gant was immediately the first thing I thought about the second I first saw him. Not only do they have to go and make a direct reference to him that can't possibly be ignored or taken any other way when he starts doing the exact same rapid clapping thing out of nowhere at one point with the exact same facial expression and everything. But that direct comparison only makes it worse because he's clearly nowhere near as well executed a villain as Gant himself.
Strongheart's biggest weakness as a character is made obvious when you directly compare the way he and Gant are first introduced. When Strongheart makes his first appearance back in Case 3, they immediately establish how imposing and impressive he is, and Ryunosuke is understandably really nervous to talk to him. The guy is meant to look scary and like someone you shouldn't be messing with lest you suffer consequences. Gant's initial entrance in Rise from the Ashes plays out much the same way. He walks in without even saying a word, and his big impressive theme music starts playing. Everyone in the court, including Edgeworth and the judge, is immediately really on edge as they sit in his imposing dead silence until— "Oh, sorry I'm late, Touchy! The traffic's been terrible recently. How have you been? Going out swimming much recently?" You see the problem. The reason Gant works so well is because he gets you to let your guard down first. They make him really endearing and likable and seem like such a nice and pleasant guy on the surface. The kind of guy who would be willing to give Gumshoe $50 if he asked for it, while reminding you of the power he wields at the same time. They make you really not want him to be the killer, both because that would be kinda heartbreaking, but also because you know how difficult it would be to take down the chief of police. As we start to find out more about him and realize his true nature, he turns from easily approachable to one of the most intimidating villains in the entire franchise without even really changing his behavior that much. With Strongheart, that twist is completely absent. They introduce him as the final boss from the jump and give you exactly what you expect. There's nothing endearing about him to initially disarm you, and thus when it comes time to reveal him for who he is, there's no impact to it. Christ, even Cortus Alba got that right. Although that guy has the arguably worse problem of not being fun to take down instead.
And making him so obvious also comes at the expense of the other attempts at side villains in this case, like Jigoku or especially Kazuma. We already talked about how you don't believe Kazuma will be the killer because of who's sitting right next to him, but I'd argue Strongheart's obviousness also hurts other parts of Kazuma's character arc. Like, the whole basis of Kazuma being presented as a possible villain in the first place is that he has this tunnel vision and is hyper-focused on Von Zieks, trying so hard to prove this predetermined conclusion and getting totally derailed when things don't go his way. When Strongheart starts falling under suspicion and Kazuma still can't accept it, he becomes near totally irrelevant for the rest of the case, and even starts acting really whiny and pathetic. Though to be fair, the latter point is clearly on purpose, as it's meant to be a low point for him, which Ryunosuke has to directly tell him to open his eyes for, and from then on, he comes to his senses and goes back to his natural state of helping Ryunosuke find the full truth. That's well done, though from that point onwards, he doesn't really have much useful to add to the conversation besides acting as moral support or being a tiebreaker to prevent Strongheart from ending the trial prematurely. It's something, I guess. He does help in a crucial enough way just by existing behind the prosecutor's bench. And at least they didn't fall for the same trap as Nayuda, whereas coming back to the good side would be a glorified prize for Ryunosuke to win at the very end, even if they came a bit close for comfort and really had me worried that was the direction he might be heading in.
Now, there is one very last twist for Strongheart at the very end that they technically haven't tried yet in this series. He points out that he has not technically killed a single person. He's only manipulated others to do his bidding, and thus can't be directly indicted for anything. An interesting idea, although one that immediately writes the case into a corner. If you can't indict him on anything, how do you take him down? Easy, pull out a last-minute Deus Ex Machina. Sholmes apparently invented goddamn holograms in his spare time in the 1800s, and thus has been able to broadcast the entire contents of this trial for Queen Victoria to see, thereby resulting in her personally revoking Strongheart's position of power and announcing that he will be put on public trial. This is complete and utter bullshit, but at the same time, I get the strong feeling that the writers knew exactly how bullshit this was and intentionally created a scenario so over the top and ridiculous, you'd have no choice but to throw up your hands in defeat and run with it. And honestly, respect. The fact that they had the balls to end it on a note that fucking stupid, while also successfully getting us hyped and not feeling out of place for the tone of the series, I can't even mark this ending against the case in good conscience. Nor would I necessarily mark it in the case's favor, but I feel like we just kinda gotta let them have that one.
And thus brings us to the end of The Great Ace Attorney. Not much to say about the very ending or credits. We get the full details of Iris's parentage, in which it turns out she's actually Clint Von Zieks' daughter, and get a nice emotional moment as Mikotoba tells you the story of how Genshin asked him to help deliver her birth as part of Clint's dying wish. Kazuma makes his full apologies to Von Zieks for how hard he went at him in the trial and decided to continue being a prosecutor. Ryunosuke prepares to return home to Japan and Susato runs to join him at the last minute. The whole time they're talking at the end, I'm thinking, haha, get a room you two. And then in the credits, they're on the steamship and it looks like they actually got a room. Welp.
Not to totally ruin that last part, but I can't be the only one who got really taken off guard when I saw that Susato is canonically 16 years old, right? You couldn't make her roughly the same age as Ryunosuke to match with how they're so consistently written to be mental equals. No, you had to make her younger than Gina Lestrade. Shu Takumi, you need to be stopped with this shit.
Well, anyway, that's the resolve of Ryunosuke Naruhodo. As far as finale cases go, it's kind of a mixed bag. It lives up to our basic expectations from the series, and doesn't retroactively ruin anything, pays off all of the character arcs in a satisfying enough way, and delivering enough great moments to keep this in the top half, especially as we get into the professor shit. It's definitely a better finale than Case 5, and never feels dragged out like that case was. But while it doesn't do that much specifically wrong, it doesn't go above and beyond at any point either, and there were a number of aspects we were left kind of underwhelmed by. And in the overall ranking, this case can go above Turnabout Corner, and below the Cosmic Turnabout. Case 11.
No.
Okay, so that's finally all our thoughts on the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. In conclusion, is this game still great and worth all the time we sank into it? Yes, absolutely, it's fantastic, but I wouldn't go as far as to say it's the best thing the series has ever given us. We probably put these two games on par with the two Investigations games, albeit with the same amount of quality spread more equally over both halves instead of pretty much all the good stuff being in the second one. The setting is great, the main cast is great, the core lineup of Ryunosuke, Susato, Iris, and Sholmes were enjoyable through every moment they were on screen. Kazuma, they fumbled in a few spots, but I respect the ambition to go with the story that took so many unexpected turns. The motion capture, acting, and animation is absolutely incredible and quite possibly the best the series has to offer yet. The soundtrack, oh my god, I absolutely love the soundtrack. And I also found that this duology is really consistently on point when it comes to its comedy too. These games had us laughing very hard, very often. Though at the same time, I don't think either game really went the extra mile on an emotional level. Not for a lack of trying, it has its moments for sure, but there are Ace Attorney cases that can get us to cry, and this game didn't give us any of that. Nothing that comes close to most of the mainline series finales.
The attempt to make these two games more directly interconnected is certainly admirable, and we'd be happy to see the series continue to try this again if they so chose. I'm sure this went over better with the fans who were frustrated at the Apollo Justice trilogy for feeling too disjointed, and like the series' tendency to avoid referencing earlier games in the series is like the worst crime ever or something. But going with this format had its drawbacks too. There's a lot of running issues of failing to satisfyingly pay off things that were initially set up, giving answers to mysteries too early that would have been better had they just waited until next time, leaving characters irrelevant when they could have been utilized in more interesting ways. And even if this is not a franchise that has ever been known for its subtlety, I feel like there were a bit too many moments where they went too on the nose even by Ace Attorney standards. Not just all the somewhat schmaltzy Yu-Gi-Oh! Power friendship type narrations that could bookend several cases, but also obviously entire characters like McGilded and Strongheart whose lack of subtlety came at the direct expense of making the story more compelling.
The Great Ace Attorney isn't the best the series has to offer, or the worst the series has to offer. It's just all kind of sitting around the middle. It's great in all the same ways that all Ace Attorney games are great, and maintains the exact same high standard we always expect out of any new game in the series. It just doesn't exceed them. It's not the amazing Ace Attorney, it's merely the Great Ace Attorney. But we'll take it either way. And that's finally the end of the video. Make sure to like and subscribe and all that stuff. We've still got more projects on the way. I'm planning to do a video essay specifically about 4-4 and its true timeline, and we'll eventually be doing more countdown videos talking about our favorite Ace Attorney characters, side characters, victims, villains, any of that kind of thing. Until then, see you next time.